All right, well, time now for a perspective. Our guest is author Jennifer Ryan. Thank you for coming in to speak to France 24 today. You are the writer of the bestseller Chilbury Ladies Choir, and her latest book is The Spies of Shilling Lane. It's the story of Miss Braithwaite, who must find her missing daughter set against a backdrop of the London Blitz during World War II. There are spies, there are Nazis, landlords, and village politics. There's suspense, but there's also humor and, of course, a bit of social satire in 1940s England. Let's begin, first of all, what brings you to Paris?
Well, I came over to talk about the women spies in D-Day, and so that's why I'm here as well.
Well, this is, you mentioned D-Day, we're set in World War II with your latest book, your debut novel, also based on this era. What fascinates you so much about World War II?
Well, when I was growing up, my grandmother used to tell these hilarious stories about the Second World War, and it really always inspired me about an interest in that era. And so I started reading an awful lot of memoirs and diaries, journals, and letters from the era. There's quite a few that are available, and it just brings that era to life. You know, what the women were going through. I think women went through the most tremendous changes during that era as a result of the war, the men going off and having to step in to fill the men's shoes. And also, I mean, war is the biggest changer of social culture. And so women really found the freedom to have their own voices, have their own ideas about how they felt. And
did your grandmother provide a template for any of the characters we find in your books?
Sometimes, not my grandmother herself, but some of her friends that she would talk about at the time. And also, you know, later in her life, I knew some of her friends who were, you know, Mrs. Braithwaite is quite bombastic, and she was based on one of my grandmother's more bombastic friends.
Well, tell us a bit more about the research you were doing. You said you've looked at old letters and everything. I mean, today you had the advantage of hindsight, but when you're looking and creating these characters and the sort of arches through the book, how did you draw on that, and what did you find in your research?
Well, I was with the spies. I was quite lucky because an awful lot of the espionage detail, people were forced to keep silent about what they did during the Second World War in these espionage agencies. And but there was a certain amount of material that has been declassified in the last couple of years, and that's now available in the National Archives in London. And so I was able to go and read, and you can actually see the physical documents that they used to keep their notes about underground organisations that they were infiltrating during the Second World War. And it's based on that and a memoir that I managed to get hold of that was published in Ireland. The Joan Miller, who was a female spy working for MI5 during the Second World War, she tried to get her memoir published and failed. MI5 managed to block it. But in the end, after she died, her daughter managed to get it published in Ireland. So I managed to get hold of a copy of that. And it just makes for fascinating reading. I think it's very interesting. And this is also about the spies that went into occupied France during the Second World War, especially in the run-up to D-Day, is the way that this evolution of women becoming much more operative during war situations and becoming much more involved. And I think espionage is one of the ways that they really saw that women were very useful during the war, particularly in infiltration situations, because they could slip in more seamlessly. And they could befriend the other women involved and so forth. So that was one of the ways that they kind of cut into the war, the world of war in that way.
Yeah, challenging the roles of the genders at the time, certainly.
That's right, yeah.
And you had this theme throughout the book. Very early on we hear it, but it's something that we can see throughout the book, the idea of how do you measure the success of a life. And with the destinies changing at the time, with women becoming a very useful operative in the war itself, that can raise a question about maybe you feel like your destiny is stolen from you, or you take it into your own hands and to find a way to make your life meaningful. But it's a very difficult thing to wrestle with at any time, especially in wartime.
It is, but I think particularly what I was looking at in this context was the generational differences between a mother and a daughter, and how, as your life progresses, sometimes the opportunities and the way that you see your life changes, and the way that you look at that, and the fact that there are certain opportunities in life where you can actually sit down and really rethink this. But the differences between the mother and the daughter, Mrs. Braithwaite and her daughter Betty, and her daughter Betty is just out there, you know, she sees the war as just an opportunity to really do the best that she can. And whereas Mrs. Braithwaite is just in a very different mindset from earlier on in the century. And that was very interesting.
A bit more begrudging, but very courageous in her own way. She also has this, what we might sometimes refer to a stiff upper lip. There's this passage later on in the book where she's speaking with one character. And it's an intimate exchange about the fate of Mrs. Braithwaite's own parents. And she says, nothing good comes out of thinking. When you're looking at the sort of way people communicate at the time, was that based on the research you had done? Was that based on your grandmother and her friends?
Yes, yeah. My grandmother spoke an awful lot about during the war. There was very much in that generation. There was very much this feeling that you shouldn't really show your feelings too much, and there was very much this feeling as well at the time that it was unpatriotic to be weeping and crying and getting down about the war, particularly with the Blitz and the bombing campaign by the Germans. There was a feeling that if you let the Nazis see that the war was getting you down, then they had won. And so there was this idea that you had to keep all your feelings to yourself. And I think in a way that was a tradition that began in the First World War and just kind of continued into the Second World War, and almost more of an old-fashioned opinion, really. And some of the characters are a little bit more nuanced, and they're a little bit more progressive, and so they understand Freud and everything, which all kind of came about earlier on in the century. And this kind of idea that you are a product of your experiences.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there, but we'd like to plug your book again. Jennifer Ryan, The Spies of Shilling Lane. She also wrote the Chilbury Ladies Choir. You can find these books on our website, also any other vending website. Thank you very much for being our guest today here at France 24. All right, time now for a reminder of our top stories. Formula One says goodbye to a legend. Niki Lauda, dead at the age of 70. He won 3 championships, a remarkable career that has left him admired throughout the sport. And a dramatic reversal in the case of Vincent Lambert. A Paris court orders doctors to resume life support. The fate of the Frenchman, who's been in a coma since 2008, has divided his family and the country.